Nissan is slashing jobs and cutting costs here in the United States. But the company doesn't want to fire anyone. And this is something that we keep seeing all over the place, not just in the struggling automotive business either. In fact, the latest government data that we got on the labor market in the United States shows no one is hiring, which is exactly what you would expect when you have all of these businesses that are cutting back on shifts, trimming hours, and even clawing back bonuses and salaries. The labor market remains in a total deep freeze. And we'll see just how much more of one it has been when on Friday, the BLS finally releases its benchmark revisions to the payroll numbers. We know payroll gains have been massively overstated, at least up until last March, which means the main jobs data is going to end up looking a lot more like all the rest of the employment numbers, which haven't been so suspiciously positive and statistically over-smooth. Now, other data from the same Bureau of Labor Statistics continues to confirm these other anecdotes that we're getting from companies like Nissan and Bridgestone and STMicro, which I talked about this past weekend. Starting with a highly cyclical auto industry, it continues to roll through what are still the early stages of its downturn. Inventories are way out of line with sales, and with so much having been piled up the last year, the entire sector is only just now going through this painful rebalancing. Yet, all of these companies are doing everything they can to avoid outright firing. They are employing, pun intended, a collective strike on layoffs, turning instead to what they call attrition. And as far as American workers go, or the global economy, it doesn't matter what label they apply to the process, the results are the same anyway. Jobs are nowhere to be found. We're coming up on 18 months of this already, and there's still no end in sight. And with a highly cyclical auto business starting to get to the same process, it only adds that much more negatives to a labor market that's already struggling. A labor market that forgot how to grow. Of course, it didn't forget how to grow. That's just the aftermath of the price illusion. And the auto business, as I said, is now struggling mightily with that aftermath, including starting with Nissan. The Japanese automaker had announced previously last year that it was going to cut a number of jobs, a lot of jobs across its entire global labor force. Now those job announcements, the cuts that were announced, are starting to become reality. The latest that was reported, Nissan is offering voluntary buyouts to workers at its manufacturing plants in Smyrna, Tennessee, and Canton, Mississippi, to scale back production and cut costs amid cooling global sales. The automaker, which is in merger talks with Honda, does not plan to shutter the two plants, which employ a combined 10,000 workers. Instead, Nissan intends to cut one shift from each site, even though it has long-term plans to continue building vehicles at both locations, just doing so at a much reduced capacity. Nissan intends to implement the shift reduction by mid-April. There will be no job cuts at either plant, and the company has, quote, never conducted involuntary layoffs within our full-time technician population in our U.S. manufacturing operations in more than 40 years of operations, at least according to a company statement. And then maybe that's the reason why they want to avoid layoffs, so that they can say we've never actually laid anyone off. But it doesn't really matter because they're cutting hours, they're cutting shifts, and they're doing a whole lot more, especially if the global auto business continues to soften even more. And there's a whole lot of data that suggests exactly that, which I'll get to a little bit later. But the entire auto business is being forced to realign with actual sales, the overall economic environment. And even if they don't want to lay off workers, the results are the same anyway. Here's another example. Tire manufacturer Bridgestone. Tire manufacturer Bridgestone America is closing its Laverne, Tennessee truck and bus radial tire plant and laying off 700 workers there, the company announced in a news release. Reductions in force are impacting our corporate sales and operations in the Americas, where a realignment of staffing levels is needed in response to the challenging economic environment. That was according to company spokesperson Emily Weaver. Of our nearly 44,000 teammates across North America and Latin America, just under 4% of our teammates are leaving the company as part of voluntary, and in this case, some involuntary workforce reductions. They prefer not to lay off workers, but they have to get rid of them nonetheless. And again, from the American workers' perspective, what does it really matter? To begin with, you might get a buyout, you might get an early retirement, and for those who get bought out, you're hoping that maybe the labor market suddenly improves between now and the time your severance runs dry. But that's a big chance, and not a lot of people are wanting to take it. Either way, what the company is saying is that we would like you to leave because you have no future here. And you have no future here because the business environment is not strong and resilient like Jay Powell keeps saying. And if it was just the automotive business or just Nissan or just Bridgestone, that would be one thing. But it's widespread, and we have evidence backing it up in terms of statistics as well as in other businesses beside. Let's talk about STMicro Electronics, semiconductor business. The semiconductor business, as Steve and I talked about this past week, in fact, the past couple of weekends with Texas Instruments too, the semiconductor businesses have been struggling to find a bottom. Every time they think they have found a bottom, they find out that the global environment hasn't found a bottom itself. It forgot how to grow. And in forgetting how to grow, it leaves all of these companies exposed to, as Bridgestone was saying, realigning their business operations with actual business. And STMicro said the same thing that Nissan did. We don't want to lay off any workers. Here's what was reported. STMicro Electronics is considering reducing its workforce by as much as 6% through early retirements and attrition, according to people familiar with the matter, as the chip maker confronts a prolonged demand slump in the industrial and auto sectors. That's the thing about the chip business. They're suffering from consumer electronics, a downturn there, as well as because a lot of semiconductors go into vehicles, the downturn in the automotive business, which is just getting started, is really what's one of the reasons why they can't find the bottom. But also, like Nissan, they don't want to fire anyone. And it continues here. STMicro is looking for ways to shrink its cost base and is planning an early retirement program for some workers, according to CEO Jean-Marc Chery. And so at least what he said on a conference call with journalists on Thursday, that's last week, adding that the company would start engaging with employee representatives about a plan based on voluntary departures. Despite a slump in the industry, which has forced a Geneva-based company to repeatedly scale down its financial ambitions in recent periods and seen its share price fall more than 45% in the last 12 months. So despite the fact that the business is really bad and that because the automobile business is starting to hit its downturn too, there's no bottom in sight, they're still not laying off workers. They're still trying to align their operations with the actual business environment through attrition. While they're doing that, the rest of their workforce is certainly seeing that, but more importantly, they're not going to be hiring anyone because they have too many employees to begin with. And fears over all of this have been driving consumer confidence, which is coming off a temporary high, back down. And more importantly, as consumer confidence has been rolling over, consumers are expressing their return to fears over jobs and incomes. The latest came from the Conference Board, which showed a pretty sharp drop in consumer confidence in January after a smaller drop in December after revisions and the peak in November. So confidence started to pick up on the Federal Reserve and rate cuts, and then, of course, a presidential election, but it hasn't lasted. And while confidence was relatively high during that couple months, consumers, their fears over jobs and incomes may have moved to the back burner, but they're moving back to the front again because nothing has actually changed. If anything, it continues to get worse. This is the labor market that forgot how to grow. What the Conference Board said was, all 5 components of their index deteriorated, but consumers' assessments of the present situation experienced the largest decline. Notably, views of current labor market conditions fell for the first time since September, while assessments of business conditions weakened for the second month in a row. Meanwhile, consumers were also less optimistic about future business conditions and, to a lesser extent, income. The expectations index, based on consumer short-term outlook for income, business, and labor market conditions, basically all the important job stuff, fell 2.6 points to 83.9. And as the Conference Board points out, their recession line is for this particular expectations index, which is based on assessments of business and labor market and income conditions. Their recession line is at 80. So as consumer confidence is coming down off of its short-term high, and business and consumers are beginning to fear over jobs and incomes again, their fear is already just about at recession levels because nothing has changed. The jobs market, still no one hiring, and businesses, employers all over the landscape are saying, we'd like you to voluntarily leave the office. We've seen the same thing in other data too. I'll point out one more. Federal Reserve Bank of New York's survey of consumer expectations. In it, they asked consumers to rate their chances of finding a new job if they were to lose one today. And the probability there fell to around 50%, which is very close to, and comfortably close to, the pandemic lows. It's far closer to the pandemic lows than it is to even the pre-pandemic period, which was not all that great in the labor market in 2019 and before. So Americans know the job market is moribund. It's not, there's a hiring freeze all over the place. And on top of that, more and more firms, whether they want to lay off workers or not, they're expressing their desire to let go of lots of those that they already have. So the statistics that we got today was from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the same outfit that prepares the employment report, the payroll numbers that we'll get on Friday, along with the household survey. Today we got job openings and labor turnover, or JOLTS. And while everyone pays attention to the job openings number, which you shouldn't, and in this case nobody will because it was down pretty substantially, which means we don't have to go through the monthly ritual whenever JOLTS job openings rises and everybody says, oh, the labor market is so strong. At least we don't get that this month. But the far more important statistic, the far more important series is hiring. And for the sixth time out of the last 7 months, up to including December of 2024, hiring has been less than 5.5 million in 6 of those 7 months. And 5.5 million is the same territory as we see on a population adjusted basis as the 2001 recession and its jobless recovery aftermath, or the 2008-2009 Great Not Recession. It's also the same territory as in the first half of the 2010s when the labor market was so bad, it basically set the stage for the entire silent depression of the entire 2010s decade and thereafter. And whenever you see hiring at this low rate, because it's so low, Americans start to drop out of the labor force. That's what happened in the early part of the 2010s when hiring was that bad and stayed that bad. And we're seeing the same thing happen here 2024 into 2025. With hiring down at low levels less than 5.5 million, the labor force participation rate has again dropped. There isn't any hiring, and more than a few businesses are expressing their dismay about how many workers they already have. Quits level, same thing, right around 3 million. It moved up a little bit here in December, 3.19 million, but it's basically unchanged from 3.13 million in November. American workers know that on a voluntary basis, just from their own volition, they would rather not go anywhere. Unless the company's offering them generous severance to go someplace else, they are staying put. The Great Resignation is a distant memory because the labor market is not robust. Layoffs and discharges, according to JOLTS, those are starting to pick up as well. Layoffs total 1.77 million in December, which was basically the same as the upward revised 1.8 million in November. And the 6-month average is now 1.75 million, which is the highest of the cycle so far. Private layoffs is right there too, 1.69 million, because the government's not laying anyone off. So private layoffs, the average is the highest of the cycle too. And while these numbers are historically low, it's not the historically low level, it's the direction of travel. And the direction and the trend continues to move higher, which suggests that as businesses are no longer hiring, this is the flat part of the beverage curve I've talked about before, when businesses are no longer hiring, the demand for labor falls too much, and they can't find enough candidates to voluntarily leave, they have to start actually laying off workers. While businesses would prefer, obviously, to avoid doing so, the business environment has become that much more challenging. Finally, job openings. Job openings fell to 7.6 million from a revised 8.16 million, which, I mean, the downward trend continues. Every time it goes up, everybody says it's a labor market stabilizing when job openings overstate labor demand to begin with, and they continue over time moving lower anyway. And bringing this back to Nissan, as far as the automotive business is concerned, I got some more bad news on that count with the Census Bureau's estimates for factory orders through December 2024 as well. And unlike the ISM's manufacturing index, which picked up to 50.9 for January, which is the highest since September 2022, the hard data from factory orders shows nothing has changed. In fact, it's even worse for the motor vehicle business or the auto business. Total factory orders, or even factory orders when you adjust for transportation industries, have been at best flat to slightly higher in nominal terms. But the real story is when you adjust for prices. Price-adjusted factory orders fell sharply from 2022, and they're continuing to decline even in the second half of 2024. So while sentiment might be higher according to ISM and even S&P Global, which upgraded its manufacturing PMI, there is no pickup in the factory sector that's detectable, at least in the hard data. Instead, it looks really ugly and continuing to get uglier, especially the production of consumer goods. But as far as motor vehicle goes, strictly motor vehicles, factory orders for motor vehicles, they had been on the rise up until the middle of last year. That's the belated cycle with the auto business catching up from the supply shock. But ever since May of last year, factory orders for cars and trucks has been going down. And they continue to fall right on through the end of the year, despite the fact that there's been, according to several sources, a modest pickup in sales. And the reason why is because inventories had absolutely soared in 2024. According to the Census Bureau, retail inventories were up 20%. That's by value in the 12 months up through September 2024. And they've only come down about 2% over the last 2 months, despite the fact that sales have risen. This is why firms like Stellantis, they saw their dealers in near revolt about the amount of cars that were stuck on dealers' lots. Dealer inventories absolutely soared because they were all expecting the car business and sales to be robust right on through 24 into 25. So they were stuck with so much unsold inventory, which meant that in order to work through that inventory, they had to halt production, which is what Stellantis did. It's what Nissan is attempting to do. It's what Ford was complaining about with dealer inventories as well. So even with an uptick in sales at the end of the year, retailers still have way too much inventory. And that's why you see factory orders for motor vehicles continuing to decline, because there's this process, as Nissan said, as Bridgestone said, as STMicro is saying in a related industry, they have to align their operations with the actual economic environment, which is not good and going in the other direction, getting worse, not better. So it makes perfect sense why Nissan would be at least trying to better align their business operations with the macroeconomic environment. Because the macroeconomic environment, contrary to what Jay Powell says, is not good. And it's not just the US, it's around the rest of the world. It's not just the automotive business. That's just the latest one to fall into the same forgot how to grow category. Of course, they didn't forget how to grow, nor did the labor market forget how to hire anyone. What happened was the supply shock. The price illusion was all illusion. Everyone was staffing up in their operations because they were expecting that to be a full and sustained recovery, a permanent plateau of prosperity, engineered by the geniuses all across the government. Instead, what happened was the price illusion, as it's being more and more revealed as an illusion, all these firms realized they've got too many workers because their business didn't come the way they were expecting. But rather than fire them and do so in a way that would be immediately recognizable as a recession, they first of all stopped hiring anyone, and second of all, have been trying to reduce their headcounts through alternative means. So it doesn't look like a recession, at least not one that everyone's familiar with, but it has all the same negatives anyway. It's the downside of the price illusion, and whether you call it a recession or not, they didn't forget how to grow. It's simply the downside. And while that may be just one man's opinion, this man's opinion, it's one that is widely shared by banks all over the world, including banks in the United States. What are they thinking? Well, went through the data in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.